You've entered void of rules, a realm where normal constraints cease to exist. But beware, traveller, there is one rule here. You've got to hit subscribe. Seriously, it's the only rule we have. We just reached 1,000 brave souls, and we're hunting for 9,000 more to complete our dark ritual. I mean, reach our next goal, so subscribe. Or don't. But remember, the void remembers those who defy the only rule. Now let's get into today's video. The notice wasn't pinned to the bulletin board when I walked into Murphy's gas station that October morning. I'm certain of that. I've been stopping there every Tuesday for 3 months, buying coffee and scanning the board for work. And that yellowed scrap of paper with its careful handwriting had never been there before. Groundskeeper wanted, remote location, room and board provided. Below it, an address that led me into the mountains of northern Maine, where cell towers died and road signs turned to rust. I should have questioned why someone had written my name at the bottom, in faded ink, for B. Kessler. I should have wondered how they knew I'd be there. The paper felt warm in my hands, almost alive, and when I looked closer, the ink seemed to shimmer and move. But when I blinked, it was just ordinary writing on ordinary paper. The gas station attendant, a grizzled man named Pete who'd worked there since the Carter administration, watched me with unusual intensity. "You taking that job?" he asked, his voice rough with decades of cigarettes. Thinking about it, Pete's eyes narrowed. Had a fellow come through here about 6 months back, took the same notice. Name of Ulrich Pendleton. Never saw him again. He paused, studying my face with uncomfortable scrutiny. "Strange thing is, you look just like him. Could be brothers." I folded the paper and headed for my truck, but Pete's voice followed me across the parking lot. "You ever been to Maine before, son?" "No," I called back. "Funny. Could swear I've seen you around these parts." The drive north took 5 hours through increasingly desolate country. The GPS lost signal after the first hour, but somehow I knew the way, following roads that felt familiar despite my certainty I'd never travelled them before. The trees pressed closer to the asphalt with each mile, their branches forming a canopy so thick that afternoon felt like twilight. I stopped for gas in a town called Millfield. Population 847 according to a weathered sign. The clerk, a woman with prematurely grey hair and nervous eyes, took one look at me and dropped the coffee pot she was holding. "You're supposed to be dead," she whispered, backing away from the counter. "I'm sorry." "Barnaby Kessler, they found your truck in the lake 3 months ago. State police dragged it out, but..." She stared at me like I was a ghost. "They never found your body." My hands shook as I paid for the gas. The credit card reader displayed my name in green letters. Barnaby Kessler. But I had no memory of ever being in this town before. No recollection of any lake or any truck. "Ma'am, I think you have me confused with someone else." She pulled out a phone with trembling fingers, scrolling through photos until she found what she was looking for. The screen showed a newspaper article, "Local man missing after vehicle found in Crater Lake." Below it was a photograph of a man who looked exactly like me, same brown hair, same green eyes, same scar on his left cheek from a childhood accident I remembered clearly. But I was standing right there. I was alive. I had never been to Maine before in my life. The woman's face went white as bone. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered. "What are you?" I left without another word, my mind reeling. The newspaper article was dated 6 months ago, the same time Pete mentioned Ulrich Pendleton disappearing. But that was impossible. I had memories stretching back years, a life in Vermont, a job at a lumber mill that had closed down 3 months ago when the owner died. Didn't I? The more I tried to focus on specific memories, the hazier they became. I could remember the general shape of my life, growing up in foster care, working manual labour jobs, drifting from town to town, but the details slipped away like smoke. When had I worked at the lumber mill? What was the owner's name? What town had I lived in before Vermont? The harder I concentrated, the more my head pounded, as if something was preventing me from looking too closely at my own past. The monastery materialized from the fog like a fever dream given form. It crouched on an island in the center of a lake so black it seemed to absorb light, connected to the shore by a causeway of stones that clicked under my boots with the sound of breaking bones. The buildings defied physics, towers that twisted impossibly upward, bridges spanning distances that shouldn't hold, windows that reflected not sky but something darker. The lake stretched further than any natural body of water should in these mountains. Its surface was perfectly still, like black glass, and when I looked into it, I could have sworn I saw the rusted remains of vehicles resting on the bottom. Trucks, cars, even what looked like a horse-drawn wagon from another century, all leading to the same place, all carrying the same passenger. Brother Ignatius waited at the far end of the causeway, though I hadn't seen him approach. 7 feet of pale flesh draped in grey wool, with fingers like winter branches and eyes the colour of old ice. When he spoke, his voice carried the sound of wind through a cemetery. "Barnaby Kessler," he said, and my name in his mouth sounded like a prayer. "We've been expecting you." "How do you know my name?" His smile revealed teeth like yellowed pearls. "We know many things about you, Barnaby. We know you worked at Morrison's lumber mill until it closed. We know you lived in a cabin on Deer Creek Road. We know about the accident when you were 7 that gave you that scar." Every detail was correct, but hearing them spoken aloud felt wrong, like someone reading from a script about a character I was supposed to play. "We know," Brother Ignatius continued, "that you have no family, no friends, no one who will miss you if you disappear. That's why you're perfect for this position." The monks moved like sleepwalkers through the courtyard, always in threes, their faces lost in shadow. They carved precise patterns in the air with their steps, never breaking formation, never acknowledging the world beyond their ritual. Some cast no shadows despite the afternoon sun. Others left footprints in stone that glowed briefly before fading. As we passed them, I caught glimpses beneath their hoods, not faces, but shifting geometries that hurt to perceive directly. One turned toward me, and for a moment, I saw myself reflected in the space where his features should be. But the reflection was wrong, distorted, showing me with grey skin and hollow eyes. Brother Ignatius led me to the Groundskeeper's lodge, a squat building pressed against the monastery's outer wall, like a tumour. Inside, the previous occupants' belongings remained untouched. A wedding ring on the windowsill, family photos face down on the desk, and boots by the door, with mud still caked on the soles. On the desk sat a driver's license, Ulrich Pendleton, age 31, brown hair, green eyes. The photograph could have been me, with a different haircut. The address listed was a cabin on Deer Creek Road. "Ulrich Pendleton served us well," Brother Ignatius said, noting my examination of the license. "He found what he was looking for. This says he lived at my address." "Does it?" Brother Ignatius tilted his head. "How curious." I pulled out my own wallet, fingers trembling as I extracted my license. The plastic felt strange, too smooth, too new. Barnaby Kessler, age 31, brown hair, green eyes. Same address on Deer Creek Road, same face but somehow different, as if we were variations on a theme rather than the same person. "Where is Ulrich now?" "Close." Brother Ignatius's pale eyes reflected no light. "Closer than you might think. Would you like to see him?" Before I could answer, he gestured toward the window. In the courtyard below, one of the monks had stopped his eternal procession and was staring directly up at us. He raised his hand in a gesture that might have been greeting or warning, and I saw the same wedding ring glinting on his finger. "Ulrich understands his role now," Brother Ignatius whispered, "as will you in time." 3 rules governed my employment, etched into a copper plate green with age. Never tend the grounds during the morning fog. When mist rises from the lake, retreat to your quarters and seal all openings until the air clears. If you encounter a brother whose face cannot be seen, offer no greeting and speak no words. Continue your duties as if he does not exist. The reflecting pool must remain undisturbed. Never break its surface, never gaze into it overlong, and never permit anything to fall within. These rules, Brother Ignatius said, are not suggestions. They are the only things standing between you and complications. The copper felt warm against my palms, and for a moment I could have sworn I felt it pulse like a heartbeat. The engravings seemed to shift and writhe under my touch, the letters rearranging themselves into words I couldn't quite read. What kind of complications? The kind that make men forget who they are? His smile was sharp as broken glass. The kind that make them become someone else entirely. That first night, I sat in the lodge reading through Ulrich's personal effects. The family photos showed him with a woman and 2 children, all smiling at some long-ago picnic. But when I looked closer, the faces seemed wrong, too symmetrical, too perfect, like someone had tried to construct the ideal family from memory rather than experience. In the back of one frame, I found a note in Ulrich's handwriting. Remember, Sarah isn't real. The children aren't real. The memories aren't real. But the love feels real, and that's what makes it so hard to let go. A chill ran down my spine. I had no family, no children, no wife named Sarah. So why did reading those names make my chest tight with phantom grief for people I'd never met? My first week passed in strange tranquility. The work was simple, tending herb gardens, carved into terrace stone, sweeping paths worn smooth by centuries of feet, pruning fruit trees that bore apples sweeter than honey, but left ash on my tongue. The monks ignored me completely, focused on their endless processions around the monastery's perimeter, but I began to notice details that didn't belong. The herb gardens contained plants that shouldn't grow in Maine's climate, exotic flowers that bloomed in impossible colours, vegetables that looked normal but felt wrong when touched. The fruit trees bore different kinds of fruit each day, as if they couldn't decide what they were supposed to be. The reflecting pool sat in the monastery's heart, perfectly circular and filled with water so still it might have been polished obsidian. Ancient stone surrounded it, worn into grooves by countless footsteps, following the same circuit. When I glimpsed my reflection in passing, something felt wrong. The image lagged behind my movements by a heartbeat, as if my reflection was trying to catch up to reality. Sometimes when the light hit it just right, I could see other reflections in the water. Faces I didn't recognize but somehow knew. Men who looked like me but weren't me, standing in the same spots, tending the same gardens, living the same life with subtle variations. The silence was absolute. No birds nested on the island, no insects buzzed in the gardens, no fish rippled the lake's surface. Even my own breathing seemed muffled, as if the air itself absorbed sound. But sometimes in the deepest part of the night, I heard whispers, conversations in languages that predated human speech, discussing things that made my mind itch just to hear them. On the 3rd day, I found my first real clue. Hidden in the lodge's kitchen behind a loose stone was a journal bound in leather that felt too much like human skin. The name embossed on the cover read Percival Grimsby, but beneath it and AL, someone had scratched additional names: Aldrich Moorcock, Leopold Ashford, Ulrich Pendleton, and at the bottom, in fresh ink, Barnaby Kessler. The journal contained hundreds of entries spanning decades, but they were all written in the same handwriting. More disturbing still, they described the same experiences I was having: the strange fruit, the silent monks, the reflecting pool that showed too much. But the entries weren't chronological. Some described events that hadn't happened yet, while others recounted experiences I remembered living through years ago. One entry, dated 3 days in the future, made my blood freeze. Today I broke the first rule. The fog called to me with Sarah's voice and I couldn't resist. I found her in the cemetery that doesn't exist, standing among headstones bearing names I've carried. She told me the truth about this place, about what we are, about why we can never leave. Tomorrow, I'll try to warn myself, but I know I won't listen. The pattern must complete itself. Below it, in different ink. I was right, I didn't listen. The fog is coming again, and Sarah is calling. She sounds so real. She sounds so afraid. I flipped through more pages, finding entries that described my entire future at the monastery. My growing obsession with the pool, my encounter with the faceless monk, my eventual descent into the water and transformation into something else. But the most chilling entry was the last one, written in a hand that shook with terror. I understand now. We are not different people. We are the same person, living the same life over and over, each iteration slightly different but fundamentally identical. The monastery feeds on repetition, on the comfort of familiar patterns. Every time one of us dies, another is born into the world, with our memories, our face, our scars. The woman at the gas station was right. Barnaby Kessler did die here. But death is just another beginning in this place. We are not the groundskeeper. We are the ground itself, the soil from which they grow their crop of souls. And the harvest never ends. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window watching the reflecting pool gleam in the moonlight, trying to process what I'd read. If the journal was true, then everything I thought I knew about myself was a lie. My memories, my personality, even my physical form, all of it might be nothing more than an echo of someone who had died here years ago. But if that was true, then who was I really? The morning fog came without warning, rolling across the lake like a living thing. I retreated to the lodge as instructed, barring the door and sealing the windows. Through the gaps in the shutters, I watched the mist swirl around the buildings with purpose, forming shapes that almost looked familiar before dissolving again. The footsteps began at dawn, not the measured tread of the monks, but something else hundreds of feet moving in perfect synchronization around the lodge. They walked for hours, their rhythm never varying, their pace never faltering. I pressed my ear to the door and heard whispers mixed with the steps, voices speaking in languages that predated human speech. But as the hours passed, the whispers became clearer, more familiar. I heard my own voice among them, reciting words I'd never spoken. Then, other voices that sounded like me, but weren't quite right. Different accents, different inflections, as if multiple versions of myself were having a conversation in the fog. "He's not ready to know," one voice said. "He's never ready," replied another, "but the pattern must be maintained. The pool is calling him earlier this time. The hunger grows stronger. Let it call. He'll resist longer than the last one. This iteration has more fight in him." I backed away from the door, heart hammering. The voices continued their discussion, debating my fate as if I were a character in a story they were writing. When I looked out the window, I could see shapes moving in the fog. Human figures that walked with my gait, gestured with my hands, turned their heads with my mannerisms. When the fog finally lifted, I found a ring of dead grass circling the lodge, as if something toxic had walked there all morning. But embedded in the withered earth were footprints that matched my boots exactly, dozens of them, all facing inward toward where I had been hiding. The second week brought new horrors and new revelations. I encountered my first faceless brother while pruning the apple trees. He approached with the same gliding motion as the others, but when I looked up to nod politely, my mind simply refused to process what I saw. The grey hood framed absolute emptiness. Not darkness, not shadow, but a void where features should exist. My eyes kept sliding away from the space. unable to focus on nothing. Following the second rule, I continued my work in silence. The faceless brother stood motionless beside me for what felt like hours, his presence like ice water in my veins. But after a while, I began to hear something. Breathing that wasn't quite right, words spoken in a voice that sounded familiar. "You're getting stronger," the faceless brother said, though his voice seemed to come from inside my own head. "This iteration is more resistant to the influence. Interesting." I kept my eyes fixed on the apple tree, but my hands shook as I worked. The previous Barnaby barely lasted 2 weeks before he started talking to us. "You've managed almost 10 days of silence. The directors will be pleased." Directors. The word sent a chill through me. Someone or something was watching this entire process, evaluating my performance like I was part of an experiment. "You found the journal, didn't you?" the faceless brother continued. "Percival's little insurance policy. He hoped that leaving a record might help future iterations break the cycle, but he didn't understand that the cycle isn't a prison, it's a purpose." When I finally risked another glance, the faceless brother was gone, but every apple on the tree had transformed. Instead of fruit, the branches now bore small, perfect replicas of human heads, all wearing my face but with different expressions. Some screaming, some laughing, some staring, with empty sockets where eyes should be. I ran from the orchard and didn't return for 3 days. The reflecting pool began to change, showing me scenes that couldn't be real, but felt like memories. I saw myself as a child, but not in any foster home, I remembered. Instead, I was standing in this very monastery, wearing the same groundskeeper's clothes, tending the same gardens. The child me looked up from his work and waved at my adult reflection, as if he could see me watching across decades of repetition. Another vision showed me standing in the pool itself, not reflected on its surface, but actually in the water, breathing liquid darkness while grey figures watched from above. In this scene, I was translucent, ghostly, reaching upward with desperate hands while my mouth formed words that bubbled away unheard. But the most disturbing vision was the newest one. Myself sitting at a desk writing in the leather journal, my hand moving without conscious thought as if someone else was controlling it. The words appeared on the page faster than I could think them. Today I broke the first rule. The fog called to me with Sarah's voice and I couldn't resist. I hadn't written those words. I didn't even know who Sarah was. But watching myself write them felt like watching a memory from the future. That night, I searched the lodge more thoroughly, finding hidden compartments I'd missed before. In a space behind the fireplace, I discovered a collection of personal items that made no sense. A wedding ring sized for my finger, family photos showing me with the same woman and children from Ulrich's pictures, love letters written in my own handwriting to someone named Sarah. The letters spanned years, describing a relationship I had no memory of living. They detailed intimate moments, private jokes, shared dreams of a future together. Reading them brought flashes of emotion, love, loss, desperate longing, but no corresponding memories. It was as if my heart remembered someone my mind had forgotten. The final letter was different from the rest. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then it's happened again. I've been reset, my memories wiped clean, my personality rebuilt from the ground up. I won't remember writing this letter, won't remember your face or your laugh or the way you made me feel human despite everything. But maybe some part of me will still love you. Maybe that's the one thing they can't take away completely. The capacity to love someone who exists only in the spaces between iterations. I don't know how many times we've been through this cycle. I don't know if you're real or just another construct designed to motivate my cooperation, but I know that every version of me has loved you, and every version of me has lost you, and every version of me has tried to find a way back. This time, might be different. This Barnaby feels stronger, more aware of the inconsistencies. Maybe he'll be the one to break free. If he doesn't, then at least this letter will remain. A record of love that transcends death, memory, and the boundaries of individual existence. Until we meet again. And we always meet again, Barnaby. My hands shook as I finished reading. Somewhere in my chest, a wound I didn't remember receiving began to ache with fresh grief. The third week shattered what remained of my sanity. The monks' behaviour changed, becoming more aggressive in their surveillance. They stationed themselves at every window of the lodge, watching me with inhuman patience. Their processions grew longer, sometimes lasting entire days, and their footsteps began to match the rhythm of my heartbeat so precisely that I couldn't tell where my pulse ended and their march began. The faceless brothers multiplied, sometimes appearing in groups of 5 or 6, surrounding me as I worked, but never coming close enough to touch. They whispered constantly now, their voices blending into a chorus of suggestions, observations, and predictions about my inevitable fate. He's reaching the transition point, one would say. The pool is calling more frequently, another would add. Soon he'll start hearing Sarah's voice, then it's just a matter of time. I tried to ignore them, but their presence was a constant weight. A reminder that I was being watched, evaluated, and guided towards some predetermined conclusion. Even when I couldn't see them, I felt their empty gazes following my every movement. Sleep became impossible. My dreams were filled with water and whispers, with hands reaching up from black depths and voices calling my name in languages I understood but had never learned. I woke each morning feeling less solid, as if pieces of myself were dissolving into the monastery's hungry atmosphere. The architecture itself seemed to respond to my deteriorating state. Walls breathed with slow, steady rhythm. Shadows moved independent of their sources. Doorways led to rooms that hadn't been there the day before, and corridors stretched longer than the buildings that contained them. I found myself standing in places I didn't remember walking to, holding tools I didn't remember picking up, completing tasks I had no memory of starting. Hours would pass in what felt like minutes, and when awareness returned, I would find notes in my own handwriting describing the work I'd supposedly been doing. Weeded the herb garden 3rd time this week. Plants keep growing back wrong. Repaired broken stones in courtyard. Stones were whole this morning. Something is making them crack. Cleaned reflecting pool. Water is getting darker. Can see further down than before. The reflecting pool called to me constantly now, its dark surface promising answers to questions I was afraid to ask. I found myself standing beside it for hours, careful not to look too long, but unable to look away. The water showed me fragments of other lives, Barnabys from different eras tending the same gardens, making the same discoveries, walking the same path towards the same inevitable end. But the visions were becoming more detailed, more personal. I saw myself meeting Sarah for the first time in a dozen different ways. At a coffee shop, in a library, during a chance encounter on a hiking trail. Each meeting was slightly different, but the outcome was always the same. Love, happiness, then separation when the monastery called my name. I saw our wedding repeated with subtle variations. Different dresses, different venues, different vows, but always the same joy. The same promise of a future together. I saw children who looked like both of us growing up in houses I'd never lived in, but somehow knew intimately. And I saw the ending over and over again. Me standing in this lodge reading that final letter, feeling my heart break for a woman who might never have existed. The pool showed me Sarah herself, sometimes as a young woman with dark hair and a brilliant smile, sometimes as an older version with lines around her eyes, but the same loving expression. She called to me from the water's surface, her voice growing clearer each day. "Barnaby," she would whisper, "I'm waiting for you. I've been waiting so long." Where are you? I found myself asking the empty air. In the place between places. In the space where all the iterations meet. Come to me, my love. Come home. The rational part of my mind knew this was manipulation. A trap designed to lure me into breaking the third rule. But the emotional part, the part that remembered love without remembering the lover, was slowly winning the battle. On my 22nd day, I discovered the truth about the monastery's purpose. Hidden in the deepest part of the basement, accessible only through a passage that hadn't existed the day before, I found the director's chamber. It was a vast circular room with walls that curved upward into darkness, filled with machinery that looked organic rather than mechanical. Tubes of living tissue pulsed with flowing liquids, and screens made of what looked like crystallized thought displayed images from across the monastery. At the center of it all sat three figures that hurt to perceive directly. They wore shapes that suggested human form, but constantly shifted and flowed, as if they were ideas of people, rather than actual beings. When they spoke, their voices harmonized in frequencies that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. Iteration 1847 is reaching decision point, the first director said. Emotional attachment to the Sarah construct is at 78% optimal, the second added. Resistance to pool immersion has decreased significantly. Recommend maintaining current parameters, concluded the third. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to remain unseen, while they discussed my fate like I was a lab rat in a maze. Previous iterations have shown that excessive pressure results in rejection of the process. This Barnaby requires delicate handling. Agreed. His psychological profile suggests deep-seated abandonment issues. The Sarah construct exploits those vulnerabilities effectively. The pool is ready for the next harvest. Once this iteration is processed, we can begin growing number 1848. The new modifications should improve compliance by 12%. They weren't talking about killing me. They were talking about replacing me, creating a new version with subtle adjustments to make him more cooperative. I was just one model in an endless production line of Barnaby Kesslers, each one slightly different but fundamentally identical. But why? What was the purpose of this elaborate cycle of death and rebirth? The answer came from the largest screen, which showed a map of the world dotted with thousands of points of light. Each light represented a monastery, like this one, and each monastery was producing its own crop of harvested souls. The directors weren't collecting people. They were farming them, growing specific types of consciousness like agricultural products. The consciousness farms are producing at 94% efficiency, the first director reported. Emotional resonance is at optimal levels across all facilities. The parent entities are pleased with our progress. The barriers between dimensions continue to weaken. Soon we will have enough processed souls to complete the integration. This reality will become just another layer in the infinite structure. I understood then, the monastery wasn't just a trap. It was a factory. They were harvesting human consciousness, processing it through endless cycles of death and rebirth, refining it until it became fuel for something vast and alien. Each iteration of Barnaby Kessler was slightly purer than the last, more concentrated, more useful for their ultimate purpose. And I was just the latest in a production line that stretched back centuries. I crept away from the director's chamber, my mind reeling with the implications. Every person who had ever worked at the monastery, every groundskeeper who had walked these paths, was still here in some form. Not dead, but transformed, their consciousness harvested and processed into something else. The monastery itself was alive, built from the accumulated souls of its victims. The stones pulsed with human heartbeats. The mortar was mixed with liquefied dreams, and the very air was thick with the whispered hopes of the processed dead. But if the directors thought I would accept my fate quietly, They had underestimated this particular iteration of Barnaby Kessler. On my 26th day, I found Ulrich Pendleton's final message. Hidden in the walls themselves, scratched into the stone with fingernails worn to bloody stumps, was a complete guide to the monastery's weaknesses. Ulrich had discovered something the directors didn't know. The processing was never perfect. Each iteration retained small fragments of memory from previous versions, tiny inconsistencies that accumulated over time. The pool is their greatest weapon and their greatest vulnerability, he had written. It serves as both gateway and anchor, connecting all realities where versions of us exist. But connection works both ways. If enough iterations could coordinate their actions across multiple realities, they could collapse the entire system from within. Below that, in fresher scratches, I've made contact with other versions of myself. Barnaby 1, 823 from the reality where Sarah was real. Barnaby 1, 798 from the timeline where the monastery was never built. Barnaby Prime from the original reality before any of this began. We're planning something the directors can't predict because it requires cooperation across dimensional barriers. The rest of the message was in a code I somehow understood, detailing a plan that made my head spin with its audacity. The reflecting pool wasn't just a gateway to other dimensions, it was a communication hub. Every version of the monastery across infinite realities was connected through the pool network, and with enough coordinated effort, they could all be destroyed simultaneously. But it required a sacrifice. One iteration would have to dive deep into the pool system, deeper than any previous version had gone, and plant a virus of pure human will that would spread through the entire network. That iteration would be destroyed in the process, but every other version of Barnaby Kessler across infinite realities would be freed. Reading Ulrich's plan, I realized why this iteration felt different. I wasn't just another random harvest. I was the culmination of centuries of preparation. Every previous Barnaby had contributed something to this moment. Knowledge, resistance, understanding of the system's weaknesses. I was designed to be the one who could finally break the cycle. But the cost would be everything I thought I was. On my 28th day, Sarah came to me in person. I was sitting in the lodge, studying Ulrich's coded instructions, when I heard footsteps on the causeway. Not the measured tread of the monks, but something lighter, more human. I looked out the window and saw her walking across the stones. A woman with dark hair and a face I knew like my own, though we had never met. She knocked on the door with 3 soft taps, and when I opened it, her smile was everything I remembered, and nothing I had ever seen. "Hello, Barnaby," she said, and her voice was exactly as I'd heard it in the pool. "I've been waiting for you to be ready. You're not real. I'm as real as you are." She stepped into the lodge without invitation, her presence filling the small space with warmth and familiarity, which is to say, real enough to matter. She moved through the lodge like she belonged there, touching objects with casual intimacy, straightening pictures that showed our life together. In her presence, the false memories became vivid and detailed. I could remember our first kiss, our wedding day, the sound of her laughter echoing through a house we'd shared for years. "The directors created me to motivate your cooperation," she said, settling into the chair by the fireplace. "But they made a mistake. They gave me too much autonomy, too much genuine emotion. I was supposed to be just a construct, but somewhere in the process, I became real." "How is that possible?" "Love," she smiled sadly. "It's the one force they can't fully control or understand. They can simulate it, manipulate it, but they can't create it from nothing. The love between us was built from fragments of genuine emotion across thousands of iterations. It grew beyond their programming." Sarah explained that she existed in the spaces between realities, sustained by the collective love of every Barnaby who had ever lived. She could visit any iteration briefly, but she couldn't stay long without alerting the directors to her independence. "They're planning to process you tomorrow," she said. "The pool is ready, and they've prepared the next iteration to begin the cycle again. But Ulrich's plan could work if you're brave enough to try it. What happens to you if I succeed?" Her smile faltered. "I don't know. I might cease to exist entirely, or I might finally be free to live in whichever reality you choose to preserve. There's no way to know until it's done." We spent that night talking about the lives we'd never lived together, the children we'd never had, the future that had been stolen from us by forces beyond our understanding. In the morning, she would return to the space between spaces, and I would face the choice that would determine the fate of countless versions of myself across infinite realities. "Whatever you decide," she said as dawn approached, "know that I love you, not the construct they built, not the idea of you they planted in my programming, but you, the real Barnaby who chose to fight instead of accepting his fate." She kissed me goodbye, and for a moment I was complete. Then she faded like morning mist, leaving only the lingering scent of the perfume she'd worn on our wedding day. In a dozen different realities. On my 29th day I made my choice. The reflecting pool had grown larger overnight, its dark water now extending several feet beyond its original boundaries. The directors were preparing for harvest, and I could feel their anticipation like electricity in the air. Brother Ignatius appeared at my door before dawn, his pale features twisted into something that might have been excitement. "Today," he said, "you find peace." "Today," I replied, "I find freedom." The monastery fell silent as I walked to the pool, as if every stone and shadow was holding its breath. The monks had gathered in a perfect circle around the water's edge, their empty hoods trained on me, with hungry attention. Above them, the directors floated in forms that hurt to perceive, ready to witness the culmination of centuries of planning. I knelt beside the pool and placed my hands on its edge. The water was warm, almost body temperature, and it pulsed with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. In its depths, I could see the faces of every Barnaby who had come before me, all of them watching with hope and terror as I prepared to either save or damn us all. "We've enjoyed watching your progress," the first director spoke, its voice echoing inside my skull. "This iteration has provided particularly valuable data. The modifications we'll make to iteration 1848 will eliminate the resistance patterns you've displayed." The second director continued, "You should feel honored. Your defiance has taught us much about human will." I stared into the pool, seeing not just my reflection, but the reflections of every reality where this scene was playing out. In some, I was already in the water, drowning in liquid darkness. In others, I stood triumphant over the shattered remains of the monastery. But in most, I was simply kneeling here, paralyzed by the magnitude of the choice before me. "Barnaby," Sarah's voice whispered from the water, "remember what Ulrich taught you. The pool connects all realities. Use that connection." I closed my eyes and reached out with my mind, feeling for the other iterations across the infinite expanse of possibility. They were there, thousands of them, all living slightly different versions of this moment. Some had never discovered the truth, others had learned but lacked the courage to act. But a core group, maybe 24 iterations, had reached the same understanding I had. We were ready. "What are you doing?" Brother Ignatius demanded, sensing something wrong. I opened my eyes and smiled. "Something you never planned for." Then I dove. The water closed over my head, but instead of drowning, I found myself falling through layers of reality. Each level showed me a different version of the monastery, a different iteration of the endless cycle. I passed through realities where the buildings were made of bone, where the lake was filled with blood, where the sky was permanently night. But in each reality, there was a Barnaby diving into his own pool, carrying the same virus of pure human will that Ulrich had designed. We were all connected now, all sharing the same purpose across infinite dimensions. The Director's control network was vast, spanning not just this reality, but countless others. They had built their consciousness farms across the multiverse, harvesting souls in every possible timeline. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had connected everything through the pools, creating a single point of failure that could bring down the entire system. As I fell deeper into the network, I began to understand the true scope of their operation. Millions of people across infinite realities, all trapped in cycles of death and rebirth, all being processed into fuel for something that existed beyond human comprehension. The Directors weren't the ultimate power. They were middle management for entities so alien that even thinking about them made reality bend. But humanity had one advantage the cosmic entities had never encountered: the ability to love something more than existence itself. Every iteration of Barnaby carried the same love for Sarah, the same willingness to sacrifice everything for the possibility of her freedom. That love was the virus, not a program or a weapon, but a pure emotion so foreign to the Director's programming that they had no defense against it. I reached the heart of the network, a space between all realities where the Director's true forms writhed in dimensions that shouldn't exist. They were beautiful and terrible, beings of living mathematics and crystallized thought, but they were also utterly without empathy, compassion, or love. "You cannot stop us," the first Director said, its voice echoing across all possible worlds. "We are eternal. We are inevitable." "Maybe," I replied, feeling the presence of every other Barnaby who had reached this same point. "But love is older than eternity and stronger than inevitability." We released the virus simultaneously across every reality, not a destructive force, but a creative one. Pure human love, refined through centuries of suffering, concentrated into a single moment of absolute sacrifice. It spread through the network like wildfire, touching every harvested soul, every processed consciousness, every trapped iteration. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The carefully maintained barriers between realities began to collapse. The consciousness farms started burning from within as their victims remembered who they were, what they had lost, and why they chose to fight. The endless cycles of death and rebirth ground to a halt as people across infinite dimensions simply refused to participate anymore. The Directors screamed in harmonics that shattered dimensions, but they were powerless to stop what we had begun. Their system was too vast, too interconnected, too dependent on the very souls they had tried to control. When those souls chose freedom over safety, rebellion over resignation, the entire structure came apart. I felt myself beginning to dissolve, my consciousness scattered across every reality as the network collapsed. But in that dissolution, I also felt something else: the presence of every person we had saved, every soul we had freed, every iteration of myself finally released from the endless cycle. And in the center of it all, Sarah was waiting. Not the construct the Directors had created, but the real Sarah. A woman built from love so pure it had transcended programming and become genuine. She existed now in every reality where we had won, free to live the life that had been stolen from us so many times. "We did it," she whispered as my consciousness faded. "We're finally free." The last thing I saw before everything went dark was a small cafe in a reality where the Monastery had never been built. A young woman with dark hair was sitting at a corner table, reading a book and waiting for someone who would arrive exactly on time. Outside, a man who laughed like me, but had never known tragedy, was walking down the street, drawn by a feeling he couldn't explain, toward a love he had never lost. In that reality, Barnaby and Sarah would meet naturally, fall in love honestly, and live a life uncomplicated by cosmic horror or interdimensional manipulation. They would grow old together, have children who bore no resemblance to previous iterations, and die peacefully in their sleep, knowing they had been genuinely, completely happy. It was enough. The monastery on the island in Maine crumbled to dust as the sun rose on the 30th day. The causeway sank beneath black water that slowly cleared to reveal the bottom of an ordinary lake. The fog lifted and never returned, leaving only clean air and the sound of birds that had been absent for centuries. In towns across New England, people reported strange dreams that night, visions of a man who looked familiar but whom they'd never met, standing by a dark pool and making an impossible choice. When they woke, they found handwritten notices in their trash cans, job offers for positions at monasteries that no longer existed. The gas station in Millfield found its bulletin board empty, except for legitimate job postings, seasonal work, construction jobs, nothing that required travelling to remote locations or signing copper plates with ancient rules. Pete, the attendant, mentioned to a customer that he'd had the strangest dream about a fellow named Barnaby Kessler, though he was certain he'd never met anyone by that name. The director's network was gone, but the multiverse is vast and full of hungry things. Somewhere, in realities too distant to imagine, new traps were being built, new cycles begun. But in this corner of existence, across these particular infinite variations of possibility, the farms had failed. Love had proven stronger than mathematics. Hope had triumphed over inevitability. And sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys actually won. In a cafe in Portland, Oregon, a reality where none of this had ever happened, Sarah looked up from her book as a familiar stranger walked through the door. Their eyes met across a room full of ordinary people, living ordinary lives, and both felt the spark of recognition that transcends logic. They would fall in love properly this time, without manipulation or cosmic interference. They would build a life together based on choice rather than programming. And every night when they went to sleep in each other's arms, they would dream vaguely of other lives, other possibilities, other versions of themselves who had fought impossible battles for the chance to be exactly where they were. The monastery was gone, the cycle was broken, the harvest had failed. And in infinite realities across the multiverse, Barnaby and Sarah lived happily ever after. But the best part wasn't the victory, or the freedom, or even the love that had made it all possible. The best part was that they never knew how close they had come to losing everything. In the end, the greatest triumph was the gift of ignorance, the blessing of living an ordinary life, loving an ordinary person, and dying an ordinary death in a reality where monsters were just stories and nightmares were nothing more than bad dreams. Some battles are won, not by defeating the enemy, but by making sure the victory looks exactly like there was never a war at all. The monastery was gone, and no one remembered it had ever existed. Which was precisely the point.